Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. The fourth letter in the correspondence between Abelard and Heloise is addressed by Heloise to Abelard. It's her second letter in this correspondence, and so she's responding directly to what he has said in his own response to her. And we see that she's going to articulate even more deeply what her condition is and what the possibilities for their relationship are. She's already suggested to him in the second letter that they could enjoy a kind of epistolary married life together, enjoying each other's company through the mediation of letters, and that this would be perfectly fine, even though they're both religious, committed, a priest, monk rather, and a nun. This would be fine because they're still married, that love is now licit or okay. He is going to reject that, say, I'm still so in love with you, you're giving me trouble. And he's going to finish by suggesting that, this should be the last discussion that we have. The next time you see me again will be when my body is carried to the paraclete where you're living. So she writes him back and she says, I was hoping to find nothing in your letter besides arguments of comfort, but I deceived myself, and I was disturbed at both the superscription of your letter. She's going to talk about that a bit. And then she's also going to, talk about the real substance of the letter. She says, I see your heart has deserted me. You've made greater advances in the way of devotion than I could wish. I can't follow you. Condescend at least to stay with me and animate me with your advice. If you're not going to be a lover to me, at least be a good friend and spiritual director. Are you going to have the cruelty to abandon me? She says, the fear of this stabs my heart. And then you've got to cap your letter by talking about you dying. Why did you bring that up? She says, you desire that after your death I should take care of your ashes and pay them the last duties? Where are these mournful ideas coming from? You should, she says, to have quieted the disorder of my heart, you threw me into despair instead. Life without you is already a punishment. So, death would be happiness if it means that I can be reunited with you. I don't want to live after you're gone. It's already bad enough with you off there in that monastery where the only way we can get to each other is through letters. And she says, why didn't you prepare me against this great crisis? It's not helpful for you to be telling me about when you're going to die. And she says, it's for you, Abelard, I resolve to live. If you're taken away from me, what good is life? What use can I make of my miserable days? And so she says, forbear to infuse into my mind such mournful thoughts. If not for love, if you don't love me anymore, at least for pity. Be a decent person to me. And then she's going to talk about the passions or emotions that she has. And she says, you want me to give myself up to my duty and to be holy God. How can I do that when you're frightening me with these apprehensions? When an evil threatens us and it's impossible to ward it off, why do we give ourselves up to the unprofitable fear of it, which is more tormenting than the evil itself? She's already quoted Seneca talking about that earlier. So she feels fear, and he's made it worse. She also feels a lack of hope. She says, what do I have to hope for after this loss of you? She says, I've renounced all of the charms of life, preserving only my love for you that I still feel, and a secret pleasure of thinking incessantly of you, hearing that you live, even if you don't live for me, And she says, this is the greatest of my afflictions. You're not giving me any help. And why are you arming yourself against me? Why are you trying to push me away? So she tells him, dear Abelard, pity my despair. Was anything so miserable? Now, why is she so miserable? Well, she's enjoyed the greatest of human things here on earth. She says, the higher you raised me above other women who envied me your love, the more sensible I am now of the loss of your heart. I was on the top of happiness, only that I might have a more terrible fall. Nothing could be compared to my pleasures. Nothing can now equal my misery. My glory was once the envy of my rivals. My present wretchedness moves the compassion of all that see me. So there's been this great reversal that's taken place, and that is pretty awful. But it gets worse. There is an unfairness. She says, what aggravates my sufferings yet more is we began to be miserable at a time when we seemed the least to deserve it. When we gave ourselves up to the enjoyment of a criminal love, nothing opposed our vicious pleasures. When we are fornicating, screwing around under my uncle's unknowing gaze in his very house, everything was fine. Things were going okay. And then we got married. You made, to use the expression that we have now, you made an honest woman of me. Our relationship was now licit. It was even sacramental. And then the whole wrath of heaven fell on us in its weight. He was castrated. She says, what right had this uncle have over us? If anything, he should have left you alone at that point. And she says, must a wife draw on you the punishment which ought not to fall on any but an adulterous lover? That's a cruel punishment for even adultery. You shouldn't be doing that to married people. And she says, we were separated. You were doing your philosophical work, right? You were teaching people. I retired to a cloister. But you were punished, and you bore the brunt of it. Both were guilty. He was punished. And she says, I was the original of all your misfortunes. Why was I born to be the occasion of so tragic an accident? And she says, I'm partly responsible. We both had sex. We both were involved with each other. I got pregnant. We had a kid for, to cap it, you could say. A kid who's now living with Abelard's sister. And she goes on and she says, there's all sorts of examples of this. Think about Samson. Think about Solomon. They were brought down by women. And she says the devil, the evil spirit, employed woman as an instrument to shake human constancy. The same evil spirit made me an instrument to ruin Abelard. But the comfort that I have is I didn't choose to do that. I'm not a voluntary cause of your suffering. I didn't betray you. I've shown you constancy and love, but they were destructive to you. She says, I have endeavored to please you even at the expense of my own virtue. I sacrificed all to my love, and I forced my duty to give place to the ambition of making happy the most gallant and learned person of the age. I thought I was doing, if not the right thing, at least a good thing. And look at all the harm that it brought about. The sacrifices that I made for my love turned out badly. Then she talks about her own condition. And she's making a case. Abelard, I'm worse off than you. It's easy for you to say, let's turn away from each other and turn to God. Maybe you can do that. I can't. She says, how happy should I be if I could wash out with my tears the memory of those pleasures which I still think of with delight. I'm still thinking about our romantic involvement, about how wonderful it was to be with you. Even carnal thoughts about having sex together, right? She says, in order to expiate a crime, different things have to happen. It's not enough that we bear the punishment. It's whatever a sinner is accounted, or whatever we suffer is accounted as nothing if the passions still continue and the heart is still inflamed with the same desires. And that's not an if, that's a given that on her part. She says it's easy to confess a weakness and to inflict some punishment on ourselves, but it's the last violence of our nature to extinguish the memory of pleasures which by a sweet habit have gained absolute possession of our minds. And she's saying that is the case for me. I am still thinking about you all the time. She says, the pleasures that I feel in spite of myself, I cannot repent of them, nor forbear enjoying them over again as much as possible by recollecting them in my memory. I'm still thinking about what we did together. And she goes on a little bit further and she says, that's not all of it. I also think about what happened to you, and I am a witness of the bloody enterprise of your enemies. I oppose their fury. So, she is pretty badly off. She actually says, now, how would you count this? But she says, I'm 1,000 times more lamentable than you. Why? Because I have 1,000 passions to combat with. I have to resist those fires which Jove kindles in a young heart. And she's telling him, this is the situation for me. She also manages to reply to one of his arguments, which is, hey, we need to set a good example for other people. And she says, I am setting a good example for other people. I'm concealing my weakness from those you've entrusted to my care, the nuns. She says, all who are about me admire my virtue. They don't know what's going on inside of me. My passions are in a rebellion. I preside over others. I can rule over them, but I cannot rule myself. I'm a false covering, and this seeming virtue is a real vice. But there's a troublesome hypocrisy that's still commendable. I'm not giving any scandal to the world. I don't shake the virtue of the feeble ones under my conduct. So at least I've got that going for me. And she says, if it's not sufficient to make me embrace virtue, it's enough to keep me from committing sin. But, what can I actually hope for? My false piety has deceived not only others, but even you. You think I'm better than I actually am. You persuaded yourself I was taken up with my duty, but I had no business other than love. Don't presume on my virtue and my care. I'm wavering. I need help from you. I need your advice. You have to sustain and guide me by your counsel. Don't say this is the last letter I'm sending you. I need your help. So she says, you need to be a friend to me. If you're not going to be a lover to me, a husband, you need to be my friend and not a seducer or a flatterer, or as we might say today, an enabler. She says a seducer flatters us and at the same time aims at our destruction. A sincere friend disguises nothing from us, and passing a light hand over the wound that we have makes us feel it the more intensely by applying remedies. She says, why don't you deal with me in this way? That's what I want from you. And then she finishes by saying, the heart of man is a labyrinth, an old idea there, whose windings are very difficult to be discovered. The praises you give me are more dangerous in regard that I love the person who gives them, you. The more I desire to please you, the readier I am to believe the merit you attribute to me. And I shouldn't believe that, because I know that I'm badly off. I know that I'm a mess. I know that I'm conflicted. So don't give me praise. Don't suggest that I have this nice, easy path ahead. Show me how to do it. Don't cut me off. Keep the correspondence going with me. If you won't follow my first suggestion of behaving like a husband and a lover, at least be my friend and provide me with guidance. And that way maybe I can get out of this despair and make my way to genuine repentance.